Cool. So I'll start with a bit of a story of why I think this topic is so important. This here was one of my absolute favorite products I've ever worked on. This is now 7-8 years ago, so I can freely talk about this. This was a tool that helps small business owners with their day-to-day managing their cash flow. It integrated with their Xero, MYOB, whatever accounting software they were using, as well as some of the other tools. If they're a retailer, their vendor, Shopify, their e-commerce tools, and some marketing tools, it would aggregate all these metrics into one place and tell them, what to focus on, what's going well, where they might need help. We launched a product together with a bank in New Zealand and expanded that over to their owning bank in Australia over the years as well. And so obviously for them, the strategy was to get closer to small businesses. That was a big gap that they wanted to grow into in terms of the market share and market segment. And so the vision was great. We had a lot of great customer feedback. We had about 1,000 businesses signed up in the first year, really actively using it. We built a great community. I was a sole product manager at the start. I got some amazing feedback on this product. Really, because they were always telling me, they were really passionate about the product that we run or the business that we're running, but they really wanted this help on the cash flow and then the metric side. But the real wake-up moment for me was when, we had a monetization strategy. Obviously, at some point, this had to go back to, we wanted to expand it to offering financial services for these small businesses. And the long story short was, it took us too long to get there. So while we all knew we were solving a real customer problem and the feedback was amazing, we took too many years to get to the actual business vision and the business value, and the board looked at it at some point, rightly so, saying the return wasn't there fast enough for the investment they have made, and we had to shut it down. So that was really the wake-up call for me as a product leader to go, right, I need to get a lot closer to understanding really where the business is going, what the expectations are on the business side. And so that's really one of the key things in whatever seniority or wherever you are in your product journey. I really encourage you to connect the dots. I always talk about the topic of connecting the dots between what you're doing in your product, the product metrics you're measuring, and the business strategy. And we'll talk about how to do this today. And one of my favorite quotes, and it has since become my mantra, is really your metrics are a reflection of your strategy. So when I talk about analytics and metrics, a lot of people tell me, oh, this is not for me. I'm not that analytical. I'm not that data driven. I'm not that comfortable with data. I think this is really, everyone can be data driven. This is really a core skill for any product leader. And ultimately, whenever you talk about metrics, I've learned that it brings up the most amazing conversations about where your business is going. Do you know what you're actually focused on? So it moves very quickly away from the nitty-gritty, like detailed metrics and analytics conversations back to, like I said at the start, why are we tracking what we're actually tracking? Right, I'll switch side. So I'll talk about a bit of a practical framework I've used personally for my teams, all of the products I've worked on, as well as use this as kind of like a workshop with both startups and larger companies over the last few years as well. This has gone through quite a few iterations. It looks really simple, which is kind of the point. But I think like one-pagers are really, really powerful tool to A, clarify your own thinking, and B, also to communicate that back to the business and your stakeholders. And maybe a quick hands up so I get a feeling for who's in the room. Who here works on a really classic like SaaS type of product with a subscription model, trials? Want to put your hands up? Okay, a few shy hands up. Maybe like a third of the room. Who here works for a more, I'd say, traditional company like a bank or a utility that has a digital arm and a digital experience? Okay, a few more hands up. Anyone here maybe more in a transaction-based business like a fintech, you work on a payments product or something like that where it's not recurring subscription but more transaction-based? 1, 2 hands. Okay, really want to know who the rest of the people are working on. Any other type of business? You can just yell out. Big enterprise software. Okay, some sort of subscription model, licensing model behind it. Okay, yeah, roughly speaking, you'd be in the SaaS category, but understand the difference. Cool, okay. So in any type of business that you're working on, I find, sorry, the reason I ask this is because I think there's a lot of SaaS metrics frameworks out there, and they make it really clear, you know, you build this feature, you convert a customer, and then they become a paying user. That sometimes is a little bit easier to map out than if you have, I don't know, you work for a bank or utility and your app is maybe not as clearly connected, right? So that's why I'll bring a few examples from both worlds into this. So let's assume you have your company vision, you have your strategy, you have your value proposition. The very first step, and we'll go through as kind of top to bottom, is really working backwards from your business goal. And again, this sounds simpler than it sometimes is. Usually there is a business goal set for the financial year, and this is usually yet to see a business goal that is not around a certain revenue growth or a profitability number. So actually, before I go into examples, can anyone share, you know, maybe if it's a public company and it's no knowledge anyway, what's your business goal for the next financial year? Any volunteers? I'll share a few examples. Yeah. What? Okay, love it. For the live stream, someone from the audience, thank you so much. So I'm working for Auckland Transport, and I understand there's a really big goal around customer acquisition, and I'm assuming there is some revenue number attached to it, which you may not want to share. Thank you so much. Cool. So a few examples of what that usually looks like. I've looked at a lot of different business strategies and business models, and these are some of the really common ones. So again, if you're in SaaS, you might have a monthly recurring revenue or average revenue per user per customer goal. Very often there is, if you look at your business strategy, an assumption or a goal or a strategy that your revenue growth will come from a certain market segment or an expansion into a certain market, or maybe you're expanding into expanding your product offering into certain capabilities. Anyone here today from Xero? No, not in the audience at least. So just to give you an example, I know nothing from the inside from Xero, but I just looked through, for example, their financial year, the annual results from 24. And they, for example, had, just doing a quick skim through, a 3x3 matrix. You know, there are three, I think it was like US, UK, Australia, the three focus markets, and then three different product areas that were big focus. They also talked about sales and acquisition costs being higher, 15% higher in the last year. So there are certain goals on decreasing those. So just to give you a very brief example of, you don't need to go through every line in the financial statements of the company if they're publicly available. You don't need to understand every single bit, but at least to get a broad understanding, where is the company growth, the revenue growth coming from? And usually it's attached to certain segments, products, or different areas. And that is really the core understanding that, while it sounds simple, I often find a lot of product leaders I talk to in the day-to-day just simply don't have that context. And often because it's not shared with them transparently, so that's a whole nother issue, but that's really the key first step. And I know, sorry, this started super dry, but this is really the key first step I encourage you to do in your product role, is to just get a crisp answer on where's your business going in the next financial year, and where is the business focusing the efforts on, where is this growth going to come from. All right, and then we're talking about the topic of product metrics, which we all wanted to talk about today. And I always say they're kind of your proxy metrics of customer behavior, right? They're kind of the day-to-day analytics you can look at and see whether you're tracking towards the overall business vision. And so this is kind of the metrics one page. This is the exercise, and it's really not, no framework is ever perfect. And this is really it gets you 80% there if you have no overall vision. I often talk to teams, they have really detailed metrics on each level, but they don't have that specific link, right? So when we talk about connecting the business and the product metrics, this error is usually what is the missing bit when I talk to most product leaders in the day-to-day. So let's go through a few examples. Acquisition. This is really where you talk about your number or percentage of completed user signups. Sometimes, obviously, you break it down further into different channels, how much they have converted, right? But there'll be usually a high acquisition focus in most businesses for that revenue growth. Activation, really undervalued metric, I find. Activation, we usually mean the aha moment in your product experience. That doesn't have to be the first time they use it, but sometimes it's like within the first week of using your product. I'll share an example of this later. For example, if you have a CRM product, you might have a aha moment where your customer creates the first entry in your CRM about a customer, right? So, and then they'll see the value of your product. That's when they go, oh, okay, this is how I use the product. They figured it out. They've actually put some effort into it. And that's usually a really good leading indicator, which we'll talk about in a second, to them using the product more long term. Engagement. The devil is really in the detail here. I see a lot of product leaders measuring daily active users, monthly active users, whatever, based on, they opened the app or they've signed in. So this is where, again, I really encourage you to do some thinking about what's your customer value proposition. What does it mean to use your product in a valuable way, right? So if you're in an entertainment type of product like a Netflix, maybe your engagement looks like spending a lot of hours watching something every week. The last time I gave this talk in Wellington, someone said, well, I work for a utility company and I work on the app that gives you the insights about your bill, basically. And in that case, you don't want people to go in and check and spend lots of time there because probably they're not they're not finding what they're looking for, right? So really think about, what does engagement mean in your specific product? What's the real customer value that represents engagement? And then lastly, retention. So this is more like your long-term churn, how long they're sticking around for. And so this is really this is an exercise you can run as a workshop with your leadership team, whatever, somewhere, or it's just a thinking exercise. This brings up really, really great conversations. And I'll share one real example. Again, this is from now a long time ago, so I can put this up. And this is really my personal vision, that because a lot of teams do their product metrics, and then we have other teams that I see that do their marketing metrics, and the sales team has their own metrics as well. And it sometimes gets really disjointed. And the reality is, if a customer makes a purchasing decision in your product, they probably at that point had touch points with your product, with your marketing folks, with sales. They've seen different things maybe on different marketing channels, right? So it gets really hard, I find, sometimes to really split it out into how does marketing, if we talk about acquisition and activation, how much of this was really through the product, through sales, through all these different channels. So my personal vision is actually that we move away from just talking about product metrics, but also creating a more holistic view for the entire company. And I've actually tried that many, many years ago. The product was what you've seen outside. It was like a tablet to sign in. So when you sign into an office, it was one of these like sign-in apps. And we had a certain goal around, our business goals, monthly recurring revenue, number of customers, and so on and so forth. And then we broke it down into acquisition, activation, engagement, retention, and then we had a couple business specifics, which usually people tag on a couple here, that's fine. And then if you're using opportunity solutions tree, for example, or anything similar to that, it fits in really nicely here because you can kind of show, here's where the business is going. Here are our different key metrics that we're tracking towards a business vision. Here are the opportunities we see to get there. And here are the solutions we think will help us with that. So to give you an example, we wanted to acquire a lot of new customers in a certain segment with a certain employee size in an office. We were losing a lot of deals on not having Active Directory integration. So people wanted to upload, didn't want to manually upload the employees to select who you're visiting. So that was one of the things for the product team to work on Active Directory integration, pretty simple. But we also had things like, partnerships, optimize certain acquisition channels, right? So you can see with acquisition, it's not just product features, it's also marketing, sales activities. And we actually ran through this once a week together with all the different departments. Now, this was in a startup team. Obviously, I know it's a lot easier to do it when you're small, but I just wanted to share this today to give you, I guess, a bit of a, start to think about how can we unify, how can we think about this in a more holistic way, because realistically, our customers have so many touch points before they make a decision. and we spent way too much time fighting over who to attribute that to. All right, you made it through the meaty section of lots of metrics and numbers. So now I just wanted to share a few common pitfalls you might have seen. Number one, and it's very related to the metrics one pager we just went through, it's only tracking lagging metrics. So what are lagging metrics? They're usually based on past events. For example, how much revenue did we make last month? How many people signed up last month, right? So you're kind of looking back and reporting on it. Very important. So I'm not saying don't track lagging metrics, but the problem is when you get to the end of a year and you then realize you haven't reached your goals and you didn't really course correct. So that's why it's really important to also really think about those leading metrics, those proxy indicators, which is usually more like your product metrics you can look at in a day-to-day. So what they are, usually they're based on a hypothesis or maybe even on some past historic data. You might go, we think because if people do X at the start in the first week of onboarding, they will retain with us longer. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. They're really good for finding early signals. Yes, I already said that. So when you look at the metrics one pager, again, the business operational metrics, typically, obviously there's also daily indicators you could look at, but in a broader sense, you know, how much revenue did we make? They become more and more lagging as you work towards the top. Here in your product metrics is really where you can kind of check in, depending on what your usage patterns are in the product, daily, weekly, and really see the signs of, you know, the people who are coming in, are they activating, which will probably affect your retention, which is probably going to affect your revenue goals, right? So that's really what I mean with connecting the dots and finding these leading indicators to future business and customer impact. So one example I had on the product I shared at the start of this presentation, when we very first launched, we had pretty high churn. So after 1 week, roughly, so every day there was lots of people dropping off after signing up. It was a pretty hard sign-up experience because you had to connect various tools like your accounting, your event, and other tools into this product and kind of go through a whole authentication flows to really get the value from it. So we knew there was a high hurdle to see the full value, but we actually had one person in my team actually went through the past data and saw there was a real correlation between what people do in that first week of signing up and their long-term retention. And because this was the value was data aggregation. And we found that if a user would add a minimum of 2 integrations in the first week of onboarding, they would have a significantly higher, we found a 20% increase in 3-month retention further down the line. And that makes sense, right? They get over that initial hurdle, they have real intent, and they really see the value of the product. And that was within the first week. So that's a really great example of finding those aha moments in your product, and it can really make an impact further down the line. And I'm not getting paid by Mixpanel. This is a random screenshot, but all of the tools have something like this. This is just one example. You can actually do, does anyone here use Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap, any of those? Okay, about half the room is putting up their hands. That's great. So all of these tools will have some feature around that. You can basically, you correlate an action with your retention. Super, super powerful when we talk about finding leading indicators. Pitfall number 2, metrics overload. This is actually a really, really big problem. We track way too much and then often lack that one holistic view that we just talked about in the metrics one pager, right? And I love this diagram from Reforge. If you have a lot of data, a lot of metrics, it becomes hard to maintain. You forget about it, you move fast, things break. So data isn't consistently maintained. It becomes irrelevant, people lose trust, and they use data less. And so that's why I always say, if you're starting with a completely new product, I think Amplitude recommends a set of 20 key events, get those right. The metrics one pager that we went through, get that starting point right, and then expand from there. Usually people then want to break it down, you know, by channel, by demographic, by whatever it is, that's fine, but just get the basic 4 or 5 key actions right, and then you can expand from there. And then there's this bucket I just call generally bad metrics. So if your tracking events look something like this and no one but one person in your team understands what you're actually tracking with this event, it's probably time for a cleanup and making them really accessible so your whole product team can actually look at those events and actually understand what they're tracking. Or I call them the spinach issue. If you have some vanity metrics, for example, your number of signups, but then your converted users kind of looks like this on the right. It looks great in presentations, but yeah, it does definitely not give you great insight and definitely not the push to actually course correct. And I always say vanity metrics, if in doubt, use ratios. So very simple example, I shared earlier, we have 51 people here today in the event that our first time at the ProductTank meetup. Now that might not mean much to you, that sounds like a lot or not, but then if I compare it, if Anthony tells me, well, the last few events it was 30 or 40, so actually it is a lot more first timers today, that puts it into context. Or to put it into a ratio, the 51 was out of, I think, 171 signups, right? So roughly a third. So as soon as you put things into context, into some sort of ratio, it gets a lot more meaningful. So just avoid these total numbers, I'd say, wherever you can. And then the very last one I wanted to talk about before we go into the Q&A. I get a lot of feedback from people when I talk about their business and the customer impact. And they say, look, this is all well and good, and I understand we need to track more towards customer and business impact, but if our new feature or whatever doesn't deliver well on that, then it might backfire on me, and I don't want my stakeholders, being angry at me. And I think that comes back to the overall culture that we're creating, and that's a reminder for ourselves as well as for anyone in a leadership position to really turn the build, measure, manage mindset with metrics more into like a build, measure, learn type of mindset, right? This is really more of a cultural thing, making sure we create an environment where people feel safe to really bring up metrics, whether they're good or bad, right? Just appreciate every time someone brings up some metrics, some findings, whether it's good or bad, at least it gives you that leading indicator, that signal, hey, we should do something about it because we all care about the customer and business impact. And I absolutely love the quote from Crystal, who's doing an amazing analytics course on Reforge, by the way. When people make mistakes, for example, failed experiment, failed deployment, failed new feature, you've already paid that cost. So we should really think of data as a way to capitalize on our mistakes and learn from them. So, and that's what I want to leave you with is really your job as a product leader is to connect the dots, right? Remember, when you're working on that feature down there, can you connect the dots to the top while you're working on this? And we're doing all of this really with the overall purpose to learn, course correct, and all create more customer and business impact. And that is me today, happy measuring. You can find me on LinkedIn, I'm very active there, and on the insightsdrivenpm.com. I love talking about metrics and hearing all sorts of stories from people, so please do reach out. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the question was in the example I shared earlier where if you connect minimum of 2 integrations, we found a correlation with the long-term retention that needed some like actual data tracking behind it for us to get to that finding. And your question was how to get there, like how to find those things where if you don't even have the insights in the first or the data tracking. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How does the team find the aha moment? Great question. I mean, obviously, the first step is to start implementing some tracking. I mean, for the product leader, I always say, again, keep it simple. Like, just write down a few events. Pick one of those big tools out there. Like, they're all great. Yeah, again, I'm not getting commission from any of them. They're all doing really great. Just get started to actually start collecting that data. But obviously, in the meantime, what I do encourage is to do good old qualitative research. So sitting down with your users if you can and just watch them, just observe them signing up to your product. usually there's like a moment where, or hopefully there's a moment where they have a sparkle in their eye and they go, oh, now I see where this product can help me or how I use this product, right? So at least on a small scale, you can start with really good shadowing, customer interviews, watching them use your product. That's my very first step. And then in the meantime, you can get some base tracking. And honestly, don't overcomplicate it. Just get started. It will be better than nothing. Yeah. Great question. Cool. Yes, someone else was down there. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the question, thank you, was I shared about that weekly review session with sales, marketing, product, and everyone in the room. What other ceremonies or ways to share insights have I found successful? So, I mean, there are a few ways. It depends a little bit on whether you're like a remote setup or a distributed team or all in the office. If you're all in your office, I've had like a simple metrics dashboard that showed kind of the key metrics. And so people are just naturally curious. They'll walk past and they'll just have a look at it and they'll start questioning you if they see something interesting. Another way was to have Slack channels where I had a dedicated Slack channel once where people could just ask from the product team, anyone could just ask any metrics related questions as they were designing, as they were building. People would sometimes be curious, or the other way around, if you can have your Slack channel, whatever tool you use, by the way, but just something that integrate. Usually all of the analytics tools have some integration. So if there's, a new report, they'll just pop it into your channel. And it's one of those really simple things, but it just brings it back into your day-to-day because, we all get busy to go and check actively. So the more you can prompt people in different environments, wherever they naturally already are, in the office or online, that will be one of my recommendations. And I think you also talked about stakeholders. I have heard from a lot of people who use the product leader, the VP of product, or whoever is in charge to share any new findings, any new insight as part of the town halls, for example. So to layer it up on the side, that could also be really effective. Cool. Yeah. I'm not sure if I caught the first part of it. So. Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. Yeah. So the question was whether I look at I start with hypothesis and then start tracking, or the other way around, I look backwards. Is that correct? Yeah. In any specific setting or in any specific situation you're thinking of? Okay. Yep. Yep. Specifically in top of funnel as an example. I mean, ideally you want a bit of both. It depends a little bit how far along in your product journey you are, right? So if you already have a lot of tracking set up and there's a lot of data to use, then obviously you have the luxury to go back into that data based, back to that very first question we talked about. The more data you already have, the more you can go back, and then you have to base it more on you can base it on historical data. But especially if you're early on, you just don't have that history of data yet. So you just naturally have to start with a lot of hypotheses. And I mean, ultimately, again, we talk about metrics today and data, but it all comes back to your value proposition, right? Like if you have a strong hypothesis, we think our customers will get value from, I don't know, I remember one of the analytics tools, can't remember, I think it was Mixpanel, said our key value is that people don't just only look at the metrics, but they also share it. So they had a hypothesis that they want to look at, sharing your reports with your stakeholders. That was the thing that they were measuring. I'm strongly assuming at the start that was more a hypothesis, but it all comes back to your value proposition, which would usually come from some sort of initial research, right? So long story short, I would say it's a bit of both, because you're always moving towards something new anyway. But at the earlier stage, you probably have a lot more hypotheses, and then over time you confirm it. You do have to look back and say, did this actually happen the way we thought? And the more you're down the line, the more data you have, the more you can use historic data to back it up. Yeah. Yeah, I think you were at the start. Thank you. Yeah. So you're saying that the activation, acquisition, they're yep. Them yeah. So I think the question is it applicable to longer sales cycles as well? Okay. Is there a specific product you're thinking of, just so we can use an example? Yep. Yeah. I mean, I was, for example, at Rome, we were actually selling a lot to services, and our sales cycles were like 12 months plus sometimes. So I know what you mean with long sales cycles. Some of the examples, daily active users, monthly active users, you're right, they won't apply in that like longer cycle. But at the end of the day, there is still some sort of acquisition journey, even though it takes longer to get to the activation, to the aha moment, to those various parts. You look at me critically. Do you have any specific example that you think? Yes. Yeah. Right. Are we thinking like custom software development, custom implementation long term? Yeah, I see what you mean. I think, I mean, then you probably have maybe like an aha moment more in the sales process, and then your engagement, I guess, will only start once you implemented the software, and whether it's internal or external, then people start using it. And actually, that's a good point you're raising it, because I find a lot of people then forget to put any sort of analytics in those types of things. So I would highly encourage to start doing that as well. But you're right, it's not the same like turnover. It's not like you have a 1-week trial, then you can see if they convert. It's a very different. So adjust it to that with those timeframes in mind. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So thank you for the addition. So also in a similar space from what I'm gathering with larger enterprise implementations. And one thing you say you're using are CSATs and NPS kind of satisfaction. Can I ask how often would you run these like surveys, or how do you measure that? How do you check in? Quarterly? Yes. Cool. And sorry, was there a question? I see. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. So the question was around how much it fits into, I guess, what we talked about, the metrics one pager, how much I do use it. So I do talk about this in the book. There is an expanded version of the metrics one pager, which is basically within your business goals. There are usually like a couple operational goals that you could break into before you get into the customer metrics that we talked about. I didn't go into that level of detail because then it becomes a pretty wide conversation, but you're absolutely right. I think qualitative data, obviously we use it a lot with the initial research, right? And then also like going forward. It depends a little bit of what sources you have available. One really good example we've used in the past was we did a lot of mobile apps at Rome, and we would actually analyze a lot of the qualitative feedback in the review. So not just a star rating, but we'd actually go, because in whatever format your customers are sharing with you, maybe you have a support channel, maybe you have those surveys quarterly, those check-ins, right? But usually they'll give you very unstructured data. And now it's actually really, really cool what you can do with, I don't know, like Microsoft Copilot or any of those Gen AI tools. You can actually just put all of that unstructured data, that feedback, if you have it in written format, put it in and then get like real like themes and sentiment, and what are they saying that's good about it, what is bad, is it overall positive or overall negative. So that's definitely something I do encourage to layer on. We didn't go into it today because I think it opens up a whole nother conversation, but I highly do recommend it. I don't have a strong opinion. A lot of people have very strong opinions on NPS, yes or no. I don't really have an opinion on it. I think at the end of the day, just make sure you do have strong sources of customer feedback. If it's in written form, actually take the time to analyze the common themes, and you can find some absolute gems in there. That's all I would recommend on that topic. Yeah, I think, Thea, you were first. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, great question as well. So it was around for the live stream. The question was around how do you engage, how do you make everyone excited and kind of include them in the process, which often is naturally a bit more in the data analytics section of a company. So one thing I did a lot of work with banks over the years, and they had, for example, some really great analytics teams, and they would actually sit on some really like good data, but they were very busy people, and as a product person, it would actually take a lot of time to you would request some reports or you want some questions answered, and then you would have to wait a few weeks until your request makes it to their top of the list and you get a report back. And one thing we actually tried once, and I think that worked really well, was to start including, I mean, most teams I've talked to don't have the luxury of having a data scientist or data analyst like full-time committed to their team. But at least if there's a way you can include, if you have a data function in your company, if you can have one of them as part of your team, maybe if you do your roadmap session, you talk about what you're working on, right? Just to include them a little bit in the process. And I think that's how we got in that example I shared earlier with where actually a data scientist showed me that, they had that correlation between activation and long-term retention. He did that, he brought that insight up because he knew what I was worried about. I was worried about long-term retention at that point. I was looking at how do we get people through an initial funnel, but then also get them to stay longer, right? If you don't provide that context to those people, it's very hard for them to serve up like the right insights. So one easy way, or easy, I say it in quotes, but to get started, to find, if you have an analytics department, if you can find a part-time like allocation, include the data scientist, analyst, whoever you have in your organization, make them part of your strategic session so they have that context, and they can often then bring up some amazing insights, or they'll go, actually, now that I know what you're working on, let me have a dig and I might find some really useful stuff. So I think it's like the same as with a lot of things that we do in the day-to-day in product, just making everyone, like bringing everyone along on the journey, communicating what you're working towards often empowers a lot of people to bring, to come along on that journey and to really contribute to it. Last one, yeah, I think. Thank you. I love that question. How do you start when there's no business strategy to start with? How do you work backwards from the top? It's a very real question. Can I ask, is this a hypothetical large company or hypothetical small company? Small company that's part of a larger company. Okay. Acquired into it? No. Okay. And the lack of strategy is within that specific business unit or also a wider within the startup. I'd love to ask a lot more questions to get into this. I mean, it really depends on where you are in the organization and who's there. So there's a lot of assumptions here I'm making. But sometimes it does help to bring up something like the metrics one-pager as a starting point of a conversation. Because yes, sometimes businesses actually do have a business strategy, but they've become so busy and actually they've moved a lot further in their thinking, but they haven't fully articulated it, right? So that does actually happen. And then sometimes this is the right point to go, you know, wherever you are in the organization, to just start that conversation, to bring up, hey, I'm just doing this exercise for myself, really. You don't have to make it like a big blown up workshop or anything to involve the whole senior leadership team, whatever. But at least to start the conversation, hey, I really want to understand the thing that we're working on right now. How can we connect this better to business impact? And then often that at least starts the conversation, and you might not come out of that meeting with, you know, the fully fleshed out business strategy, because these things do take a lot of time and thinking. But at least it gets the conversation started. And the last thing I'd say on that, sometimes I do see some really great examples of people bringing up some insights bottom up that actually then inform the business strategy, which is great if you don't have a business strategy to start with. To give you an example on that, I remember when we did the small business product I talked about, we actually saw there were quite a few users that we noticed that were adding a lot of businesses in their account. And I was like, oh, who are these like really busy business owners that run, I don't know, 10 different businesses? And it turned out they were accountants. And so that was, they were just like using it to manage the different businesses they were looking after, which, you know, was just something that was never on our radar. It was never on our initial business strategy. But then we saw it, we noticed it. We didn't decide to go down there. Actually, there's another product that is doing really well in that space these days, which is great for them. But just an example, sometimes you find these data insights, these nuggets, you can bring them up to your leadership, and then they might actually inform the strategy, right? So yeah, hopefully that helps. Okay, yeah. So a lot of hypothetical scenarios today. Yeah. Okay, if your early stage startup, you know what you want to track, but you don't have that much budget, or you need to be resourceful to get started. I mean, all of the tools have startup plans, and usually they scale up with the number of events. So I don't know, it depends a little bit. If you're early stage startup, but you have a lot of customer traffic already, they might get really expensive, like whichever one you use, to be honest. I don't have a strong like use this tool or that. Just use a startup tool. Honestly, they're all great. For me, I've seen a lot of teams use all sorts of different products, even GA, which I didn't used to be a fan of, but you can actually do a lot of stuff. To me, the thinking and just getting started is a more important part than getting the tool right most of the time. But just if you do sign up to any of them, like Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap, like they're all great. Pendo, I know a few people using it. They're all market leaders. They all do a really great job. Just be aware of how they scale their pricing model. A lot of it is based on number of events, which even if you're a startup, you have a lot of events tracking, that can become a bit expensive. Yep. Thank you. Mhm. Okay, so the question is, if you're the first type of product in a certain market or a certain, does the product like, what do you track? Does the product exist in a similar shape and form in other markets? And then do you have some inspiration from those on what they're tracking or what they're working towards? Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, sorry, for the live stream, it's probably a bit hard to follow. So you're saying it's launching into New Zealand, so you're expecting there's a different customer behavior, not launching. Okay, researching whether. Okay, I mean, so if you're in the research phase, I think there's a lot more. Obviously, it sounds like you're already doing your market data, market research, stats, all that good stuff. Have you done any customer interviews, like qualitative insights already? Okay, and then so now, what is the major risk? So, for the live stream, she said yes to everything. What else are you? What else is holding you up from launching? Yes. Right. Okay. So the question is like, what do you have to track, or like what data should you look at before you're kind of certain to launch into a certain market? I guess this is a bit related, but not really to what we talked about today. But I think one of the models from that Marty Kagan always talks about like the different risks that you have when launching anything, like a feature, a business, whatever. Like on one side, it's the technical, like the technical feasibility risk. Like, is it going to be feasible launching it in New Zealand? For example, if your product requires a lot of data integrations, like are those data integrations and the data sources there, then there's a business risk. Like it sounds like you've already done a lot of general market research, business like data on the market size and the opportunity. Then it sounds like you've done customer interviews, which is more is this going to be valuable? So the value risk you've already done. So I guess at some point there is only the point of going into the real world and seeing. But I guess as with any new business or new venture or expansion, to start maybe in a small way so you can test. But yeah, at some point I love data, but there is a point of you just got to take the leap and launch something into the real world. And sometimes you'll still find things that are very different to what you thought in the research would happen. But that's, yeah, part of the process. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, that's the last question I've been told. Yes, you made it. Thank you. Did the live stream get that? Mhm. Yes. So the question was maybe a story or example of where I had to convince stakeholders, leadership into investing in the type of tooling. Yeah, we at some point, so okay, at Rome, for example, we were working on lots of different products with lots of different companies. So I've had the same conversation about 1,000,000 times. And often people like the senior leadership love the idea, but then they don't want to spend the money or the time. Like they don't want to delay a product launch because you want to make sure you're having all the analytics set up, right? And that's just where reality just kind of hits you. So I don't know if this is the best recommendation to make, but I always found a way to just do it in a small way with, obviously you'll need some budget, but I just try to, if it was a new product, for example, I would try to get on like a startup plan or maybe at least like a free trial of one of the analytics tools. At the end of the day, you just need like one person to be the champion, like me as a product leader. That was usually me. I would just write down, these are the 20 events I want to track. I'd go to the developer, I'd sign up to a free tool and then start using it and then show the leadership team, this is what you can see. This is the type of insight you can get. And at that point, they could see the value and it was a lot easier of a discussion. I had a lot of I definitely had a lot of conversations around that where they liked the idea but didn't want to spend their time and money. So sometimes finding like scrappy ways to just get to show them the actual tool, because it's really abstract for a lot of people. They just haven't worked with those types of tools like Mixpan or Amplitude before. So I get it. So sometimes just showing them that has worked really, really well. And one thing I did do that was once with executive team from one of the Australian banks, I did do that metrics workshop, for example, but I didn't label it as a we'll talk about specific metrics or anything. It was more of a we just want to align on the overall strategy and the key value proposition. So whatever language, will work for the certain stakeholder you're working with. So I made that I labeled it as a strategic workshop. And then I got the right answers from it on what I need to go and track out of that workshop, if that makes sense. That worked a treat. Cool. I think that was the last question.
All right, a big round of applause for Corinna.